Hi there, guys. My name's Thomas Page. I'm with the Transgender rights movement. And this morning I woke up to read a new study about homeless LGBT kids. And it brought up a few things. This is a study that was conducted by the Center for American Progress. And it's a very interesting and in-depth study regarding the difference between the numbers and statistics of LGBT kids as opposed to their heterosexual counterparts and um, experiences with homelessness and violence, suicide rates, and other things like that. One of the things that came up when I was reviewing the study was that I noticed that transgender is lumped in with the rest of the LGBT community in this study, except for one part. And that one part is the average age of a child who becomes homeless. For the rest of the gay and lesbian population, it's about 14 and a half. And for the transgender youth, it's about 13 and a half. And I want to talk a little bit about the study very quickly. You can get all of this information on the internet. I will provide a link along with this video so that you can go and check out some of these numbers yourselves. But I also want to talk about the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation and how we still as a society tend to lump these two things together. It's interesting that, for instance, in employment, we've seen a lot of non-discrimination acts being enacted in different employment situations. Most of them still don't contain the wording gender identity. Every time I read something that an organization or an employer says about being non-discriminatory, I look for gender identity because it's a totally separate thing. And I think that one of the issues that we're facing as a society is the overall exclusion of transgender people in a lot of these spaces. For instance, it's a lot easier to get a job as a gay or lesbian person or bisexual person than it is as a transgender person. A transgender person who has changed their name and perhaps their gender has to wipe out their entire work history from their old name when they go to get a job in their new name. So it's like you're starting over again at whatever age you're at. For me, it was 20 years old, and I had a vast and strong work history behind me, but the fear of not being employed as a result of my gender identity prevented me from being able to even apply for some of the jobs that I wanted to apply for. And I even once went to get a job at Target. And Target considers itself an organization that is very inclusive. But when I went to get a job with them, the thing is, with a transgender person, your name and gender might change, but your social security number, which is what's used on background checks, always stays the same. So even if I've been on hormones for 12 years, even if you've been transitioned for that long, an employer can still go into your background and see an old name or something like that, and suddenly, a red flag is raised. Well, why is this person giving me a different name? And it's up to one person who's reviewing your file to say whether they want to have a conversation with you about it, or whether they are even willing to consider you for hiring at that point in time. Now, I already had a bachelor's degree when I was applying to work at Target and just get a job to get by, and I found it really difficult to get through that process. And when I finally did almost get hired, I got a phone call a week later saying, we found something. in your history that doesn't match up, so we're not going to be able to offer you employment. And I actually somewhere still have the letter that they sent me. So, not being able to even get a normal retail job just to get by is a problem for transgender people, and this is part of the reason that a lot of us end up out in the streets. And then there's the whole idea that LGBT rights always include trans people, and that's not true. There has been a big push for inclusion of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in a lot of spaces in our society, but the same has not happened for trans people, which is why organizations like the trans rights movement and all the organizations that we work with and support the efforts of have to exist. For instance, there are employment programs out there that are specifically for trans people. The reason why those programs exist is because these programs take the time to find employers who are willing to specifically hire trans people or not discriminate against trans people when they're applying for jobs. A lot of us actually end up getting work in the trans community, serving our own community, because we know that that's the safest space for us to get hired and to maintain employment. Now, when you look at some of these numbers here, last year, for a while, I worked with homeless LGBT kids. And the organization I worked with was a beautiful organization and really did their best to help to accommodate all these young people. The problem is that it becomes a revolving door because of the fact that a lot of the other organizations that are out there for housing and things like that are not serving the LGBT community or creating a safe space for them to live or to get back on their feet. So these kids come to a space where they know that they'll be safe. And what happens is all of these spaces where people come to get services are overburdened. And a lot of these young people really needed some mental health support. Think about being 13 years old and being on the street. Think about what these young little kids have to do to survive on a daily basis. Some of them are doing sex work at a very young age, simply so that they have food to eat. I feel very fortunate that I've never had to do anything like that. But a lot of my brothers and sisters have. And the organization that I worked for accepted people starting at around age 18. So now there's a gap here between kids who are about 14 and 18 years old who need the services but don't have any way to get them. We talk about putting these kids into the foster care system, and we talk about social spaces, institutions that they can be put in, but a lot of these spaces do not protect LGBT kids, and especially do not protect trans kids, mostly because of the fact that the education around these issues doesn't exist in a lot of our higher institutions. And when we're not serving everyone in our community, we're creating a problem that becomes more stigmatized. And what actually happens here is you get statistics like those that were released today, showing that the LGBT community has a much greater rate of homelessness in proportion to the heterosexual community of young people. A lot more experience with drug abuse and violence, a lot more experience with attempted suicide. And it's all because of the fact that we're not willing to take this community and consider it as part of the whole community that is our social services community. And this is really present also in the medical field. If you're a trans person who is on hormones, that's something that you need to be taking for pretty much the rest of your life. Some people will take hormones for a long period of time and then stop taking them. but a good portion of us stay on hormones, especially if we haven't had surgeries, which most of us can't afford. When I try to get my hormones, I have a limited number of places that I can go to get them signed off on. Because what happens is, as a controlled substance, testosterone, which I take, it's highly regulated, and you have to have a medical doctor sign off every time that you get a new prescription. And it's become even more like that now. It used to be once a year you would have to get signed off, and they could continue to fill your prescription for the year. But now it's become that every time, which is 3 to 4 months, that you go to get your prescription refilled, it has to be signed off by a doctor who approves it. So when I came out to Los Angeles, I had a doctor from the East Coast, and I could no longer go and get my paperwork signed off by that doctor, who is an endocrinologist, because of the fact that I hadn't been able to go in for appointments for a period of time because I was out here. So I ended up running out of hormones. I didn't know where to go to get more hormones. And I started calling around different endocrinologists in the LA area, saying, I'm a transgender person. I need somebody to come in and do a consultation and sign off on my hormones for, the next period of time. And clinic after clinic that I called said that they don't work with trans people. And this is a specialty. So this clinic doesn't serve the trans population. Now, think about that for a moment. There are biologically born men and women in our society who go to endocrinologists because they have hormone imbalances. There are a lot of men out there that actually have to take testosterone supplements because of the fact that their testosterone levels are not proper for their body and their body chemistry. And these people can go into any endocrinologist's clinic and get signed off on the same hormones that I take. But because of the fact that they're not transgender, they can be served. It doesn't make much sense that a doctor who specializes in something is willing to serve one part of the population but not the other simply because of their gender orientation. Now, when I'm talking earlier about the overburdening of all these systems that work with trans people, it took 3 months once I finally started to figure out where I could go to get hormones to get into a clinic that serves trans people as well as homeless people. So luckily, some of the trans organizations in Los Angeles have been able to work with this clinic and say, we really need you to also serve the trans community. So they started to do that. And what I had to do at times was get up at about 3 o'clock in the morning, take a 45-minute walk to the train, take the train downtown, take another 45-minute walk to the clinic, and sit there for 2 hours or so just to be seen by the doctor and have him sign off on someone physically giving me my shot, because they didn't actually offer prescriptions at that clinic. So I did that for a while, and as somebody who had already had a prescription and was self-injecting for years before this, it was difficult. And at the time that this was going on, the LGBT Center was actually starting to serve the trans community. But again, they were only taking on a certain number of patients because there's only so many patients that can be served by the small amount of people that work there. And even now, the doctor who specializes in trans people is only there a couple of days a week. So when I want to get my hormones refilled, I have to make sure that I do it about 2 weeks ahead of time, trying to get somebody to fax to my pharmacy, which is out of state, my prescription once again. and hope that I get my prescription delivered to me before I run out of hormones, which if you talk to any trans person about being off their hormones for a couple of weeks, it's not a pleasant experience psychologically, emotionally, or physically. So we think about these things, and you think about the pharmacies that will very quickly give you pain medication within the same day. And if they don't have the exact pain medication that you're prescribed, they'll find something in the pharmacy that is suitable and fits with your insurance. And that's fine. That's great. The same thing is not true for hormones. Sometimes you go into a pharmacy and they don't even carry the hormones that you need, or they have to special order them and things like that. So this is a little bit of a failure of the system on all levels. And the reason that it takes so long and you have all these waiting periods to get hormones and hormone treatment and prescriptions is because so many of us need the same service. And if you miss an appointment, you're kind of in trouble. So when we look at the medical health care system and we look at some of these other social services and we realize that the burden that's created for those who are serving the trans community specifically is exacerbated by the fact that the rest of our system is not well trained and not inclusive of the community. You can see where all of these breakdowns happen in society. So the way that we can make it easier on this community and on our society as a whole, which considers the LGBT community to be somewhat of a burden at times, is to make all of our services inclusive of all people. When there's no longer a way to discriminate against people, you give them a fair shot. And I think that that's all that anyone who's a transgender person in our society is looking for. Education, employment, healthcare and social services as needed. When we exclude one group of people from these things, we actually create a problem in society that now we have to fix through emergency systems, through emergency mental health care systems, through law enforcement. A lot of the problems that are existing with these young people out on the streets with drugs and other crimes that are committed are simply a result of being on the street. I remember one young person that I worked with last year saying, the hardest thing for me is that there's nowhere for me to be that's legal. So if I can't get a bed in here, I have to be out on the street. And at night I have to move around all the time. Because if an officer sees that I'm sleeping on the side of the street, they may arrest me, or they'll tell me to find somewhere else to be. And the other part of it is, when these young people are walking around outside at night because they have nowhere to go and they can't stay in one place, officers then say to them, "Are you out soliciting?" So there's nowhere for these folks to actually go unless they find a shelter. And if most of the shelters in the city aren't open and accepting of trans people and creating a safe space, and this goes across the whole LGBT community, then we leave people out on the street as garbage. And we give people the idea that they're garbage. And we create a much greater problem than the problem of crime. So the question here is what we can do to educate everyone across the board regarding this community, and how we can create a safe space within all of our spaces to serve the trans and LGBT community. When we're able to do that, we don't see these skewed numbers anymore. These numbers exist because of the fact that we've created the situation that puts people in that space. So I'm hoping that maybe if we get into some more of these statistical numbers, and I would love to see the raw data, again, for the Center for American Progress on this study so that we can actually separate out trans people and see what the proportion of trans to LGB community members is, in the same way that we've seen the proportion of LGBT community members as opposed to their heterosexual biologically born counterparts is in homelessness and other statistics, so that we can actually see a little bit of a difference where these issues are and how important it is to address them. So I hope that some of what I said today hit home with somebody, and I hope you're having a wonderful weekend.